he's probably saying let's aim high, and maybe if we get to 60 or 70 by 2025, I don't think he seriously expects homes in the Shetlands or something to have fibre. But, well, actually they might, because they tend to sometimes do those little community projects, don't they? But he probably doesn't seriously expect it to be everywhere. But
are you saying that to make 5G happen, we should aim for 6G then? Just like
the even numbers always do better.
They always do better.
Hello and welcome to another telecoms.com podcast. I'm joined this week by Ian from Light Reading, and we got special guest, returning special guest.
Indeed.
William Webb, you're a telecoms analyst and all-round expert on this stuff. So I bring you on to sort of humiliate me and show me up for the dilettante part-timer that I am. Yeah. But that's how I know. Joking aside, it's great to have you on, and we hope to sort of dig into some meaty, techie stuff. What else do I need to do before I'm allowed to get on with it? So I've got to do the bit where I go,
SoundCloud,
if you're watching it, you what?
SoundCloud or whatever?
Yeah, I know. It's building up because I've got plugs for our own stuff that I have to remember to do. So if you're watching it on the site or on YouTube or on Facebook, then you can list it on SoundCloud or iTunes or countless other podcasting platforms.
Actually, you know what? Again, iTunes is more like Apple Podcast now.
They rebranded it now?
Yeah.
Apple Are they getting rid of iTunes as a brand?
They're going to get rid of it.
It's Apple Music, isn't it?
Well, no, there's Apple Music and Apple
they've just broken it up.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean,
do you think well, obviously they're not going to rebrand the iPhone, but it's getting the impression that as a sort of prefix is going out of fashion in Apple world.
Yeah, I wonder if ITV hadn't existed before, if they had called it ITV, you know?
I seem to remember there was something when they were thinking about telly and ITV when they didn't think about it. So it's not going to happen. Another plug for our event coming up on November the 7th, which is called telecoms.com Live, where we're basically attempting to recreate this kind of vibe in a live setting.
People can heckle.
Well, I'm hoping William will come along. And
William is coming.
And heckle.
And that's good news. And you're free to heckle, and you never know, if some other people don't turn up, you might be a super sub. So
people can heckle me.
Yeah, bring your A game.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, you'll be welcome. And so that's the point. Any other people want to come along, want to join in, want to just see me and Jamie improvise in a live setting? God knows how that's going to play out. But that's on the morning of the 7th in the Montcalm Hotel in Marble Arch. So go onto the website, look for any of the banners or whatever that talk about telecoms.com Live, and sign up for it, and it'd be great to see you there. And of course, then we're going to have the awards in the evening. Do you remember last week Ray and Pierre kept prodding me, and we got the awards in the evening, which of course you're also welcome to come to, but you got to pay to get into them. Whereas live, you can just turn up. So there we go. That's it. I think as far as plugs and all that sort of thing goes. Yeah, am I good to get on with it? Right, I will then. So, William, you were saying you'd had some ideas of what to chat about, but you were hoping there'd be some kind of news hook.
I was.
Coming in, and luckily there was today. The main... sorry, I'm just muting my phone here. It's beeping away. The main story we wrote today... Oh, crap, I just remembered I didn't send the newsletter. Oh, I'll have to do it after. Live screwing up. Was about there's a cunning plan. Jamie wrote this, so I'm going to be a little bit sketchy, but I did read it. I promise, Jamie.
He doesn't listen to this, don't worry.
Yeah, it's true. If he's not involved, he's just not interested. A plan for all of the UK operators to combine over rural connectivity.
Indeed.
So we've got a thing where obviously all of them have got plenty of radio masts and stuff in urban centres and major arteries and all that sort of thing. But if you live in the sort of middle of nowhere or whatever, then it's a different story.
Yeah.
And the government and Ofcom were always trying to put all these conditions on licences for coverage. But once you've covered about 90-95% of the land area, or even the population, depends which metric you use, it starts to become a seriously law of diminishing returns. So why don't we? That's what we'll start talking about. Why don't you give us your first impressions on all that?
Yeah, so I think it's actually really interesting because it's really different. So as you rightly say, up until now, governments have used coverage obligations on the licences, the spectrum licences, when they wanted to encourage operators to roll out further. And that kind of worked because the operators saw spectrum as such a valuable commodity you could throw in a bit of an obligation. It didn't really make much of a dent in the value.
Yeah.
Everyone got on with it. It was all hunky-dory. And Ofcom were planning to put coverage obligations on the 700 megahertz auction, which is coming up, which is the lowest of the 5G spectrum. But they were starting to get worried about, if we put too many obligations on this, maybe this isn't so valuable anymore, and we could actually get to a situation where nobody wants to license this because the obligation is worth more.
Or the auction doesn't go as well as the government doesn't go to coin it from the telecoms industry again.
So suddenly this is a complete departure. This is, well, let's take it outside of the auction space and let's club together. So this is the first time all the operators have got together. And they've got infrastructure sharing, of course. There's two different groupings. But this is one grouping.
So it's effectively, actually, not rather than grouping 4 into 1, it's grouping 2 into 1 if we're talking about infrastructure, isn't it?
It is. And in a way, this is the sort of strange point about UK competitiveness and where this is heading, I think. So you kind of think, we've got 4 operators. So we've got 4 competitors. But as you rightly say, they're in 2 infrastructure groups. We've only got 2 sets of masts.
Yeah.
And in rural areas, we're only going to have 1. Is this a precursor of moving to
Another thing I'm wondering about, because I don't know the answer to this. So we all see the masts when you go down the motorway or whatever. I sometimes rather tragically point it out to my kids to their total indifference. But on each of those masts, is there... So you wouldn't get all 4...
You can do.
On a mast?
You sometimes do. So it's a bit of a confusing picture. There are some masts that are owned by other players outside of these 2 mobile operator groupings. So Arqiva were a big mast owner. They just sold all their masts in a recent transaction to
I think I read about that.
Cellnex, I think they're called, a tower company.
Yeah.
So in those cases, you can get, in some cases, all 4 of the operators.
And presumably the tower company wants the business of all 4 of them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that, in a way, is their pitch. Let us buy all your masts, and then we'll squash everyone onto the same masts, and we'll lower your operating costs. And we've heard both Vodafone and Telefonica saying they want to sell their masts because they need some money because their debt burdens are too high.
Yeah.
So we can see that trend happening as well. Masts being crashed into one entity that'll probably consolidate them, and you'll end up with all the operators on all the same masts.
Then all we've got is duplication of actual RAN gear, but wouldn't we still have to have that to some extent?
Yeah.
They can't share the actual antennas and stuff, can they?
Well, they are doing.
Yeah?
Well, in some markets they're now doing.
Tell me. I'm just showing my ignorance again.
Well, that's the big plan in China. That's what one of the big news stories from China over the last few weeks. That China Telecom and China Unicom, which are the two slightly smaller players in China Mobile, are basically building a shared 5G network. So
all the way down to every.
So they'll be sharing base stations as well, and that happens to some extent in the UK.
And they just have to have some clever way of not treading on each other's toes.
They say things like network slicing makes... I think they can do that anyway, but they've said that things like network slicing makes it easier to do that. But they were resistant to doing that sort of thing years ago. But I think, as William says, the circumstances they find themselves in now, where in some European markets they've spent... Say Italy, for example, there's a lot of active network sharing now going on. And it's not a coincidence that the Italian auction raised a vast amount of money, and they've had debts anyway, so they're kind of struggling with the situation there. And it's driven companies like Vodafone and Telecom Italia, I think, are doing an active network sharing deal. And then you've got Wind Tre and Fastweb building a shared 5G network as well. So, and in the UK, it's a bit more nuanced. There's some areas where there might be some active sharing going on, but mainly it's passive.
But competitors don't collaborate unless they're forced to by sort of economic circumstances. Typically, do they? Or
they still differentiate themselves on tariffs and lots of other what you bundle into an offer.
But then it almost just becomes a bunch of MVNOs in that respect, where the only differentiation is just the commercial end.
And in a way, we're already at that in terms of differentiation. So I can't think of any network that's materially different from any others.
I mean, you get the reports, don't you? I can't remember who are the ones that do it all, but EE tends to do quite well.
But I think 5G is going to exacerbate this, because if 5G is as good as it's meant to be and it provides unlimited capacity, and we don't really have any of those issues that you get at the moment. Like even in central London, I sometimes struggle to get a 4G signal because there's a lot of people in this cell, and everyone says, well, that's not going to be a problem with 5G. Then there's even less scope for differentiating yourself on the technology side. Everybody's using it, everybody's going to have the same level of service, more or less. I mean, who cares if you're getting 800 megabits per second compared to 700 or 650?
Yeah.
So they have to look
that's not a very powerful differentiator in marketing.
No.
I mean, people do, technology marketing tends to be quite metric, but and I think we might come onto this when we talk about fixed line as well. If you say to someone, we'll give you an average this, and someone else says we'll give you an average that, and the difference is 10% either way. It's not going to stick in your head as a marketing differentiator, is it?
Yeah.
No. So
Exactly.
it becomes things like whether you get a free lunch on a Monday from a sandwich shop or something.
Yeah,
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
like the way insurance
Something a
companies
bit more
differentiate.
tangible.
You know,
Yeah.
give you a cuddly toy that looks like a meerkat or something stupid like that. That's what the operators will probably start doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You
That's
heard it here first.
That's an incredible thing. I've actually satirised that in some writing I'm doing. The thought that you could be incentivised to make a massive capital purchase like a car with the lure of a cuddly toy or a bottle of wine or something or whatever.
Yeah.
It's just so trivial. But as we say, that's what sticks in people's heads. These people will have done their research,
And
haven't they?
they're doing that to some extent anyway with the sort of bundling Amazon subscriptions in for free. You're trying to do zero rating of some of the top services, that you get offered these days. I mean, it's more, I suppose it's a bit more on the broadband side that's happened, but fixed broadband. But you do get, I mean, as an EE customer, I see them offering things like Spotify subscription for a few months when you first sign up, and you don't pay additional for it. So they've obviously done some kind of deal with Spotify for that.
Yeah, there's that, and I think we should get back onto that in a sec once we've finished exploring this news story, because I know certainly one of the things, William, that you said that you'd be interested to chat about is sort of 5G profitability.
Yeah.
But before we go there, one thing I want to know your view on. So they've said we'll put $500 million, we'll commit collectively $500 million to this investing in infrastructure, and the government said they match it with public funds.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? Because I'm always a little bit, my default setting in terms of politics is I'm sort of small government. I guess you'd probably call me centre-right. I'd rather the government was less involved. You obviously need a government. You obviously need, police and you need some degree of health that's free at the point of delivery and so on and so on and so on. But I just get a bit twitchy when the government gets too big. And I definitely get twitchy when the government sort of participates in private markets.
Yeah.
And that's the bit. And I know, there's an incredibly high barrier to entry, which is why it has to be regulated.
Yeah.
But, for some of my taxpayers' money to just go towards rural telecoms infrastructure, I'm not so sure about. What are your feelings on government matching their pledge?
Yeah. So I think you're quite right that, in a way, the world's a much cleaner place if you've either got market stuff and then you've got government stuff.
Yeah.
And you can see that, government has to do military and education and police force and so on, because that's just not going to be provided by the market. So that's kind of clear cut. And, supermarkets are going to do their nice competition stuff, and that's all fine. The problem with mobile is it's kind of landed itself somewhere in the middle, where it started off being a market and that was fine. It's now become socially necessary. It's like critical national infrastructure. And
Which is why politicians bang on about it.
And governments are looking at it and saying, with some justification, we've got to have this stuff. We've got to have this stuff because our country can't operate effectively without it. People are going to be disadvantaged. It's part of the critical infrastructure, and therefore it's our remit to start playing in this. But in a way, you can't half tinker with it. You've either got to decide to really tinker with it or to leave it well alone, because if you start twiddling at the edges, you tend to mess stuff up badly. And that's And that's kind of what they're doing.
When you've got to be careful not to pick winners and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Now, I think they're going to get away with this one because it's been an agreement amongst the mobile operators. So they've not been told by government, you must do this. Essentially, they've come to government and said, we're prepared to do this collectively. So in a way, it's not too distortionary. But nevertheless, it's certainly the thin end of a wedge. And I can imagine increasingly governments intervening to require networks to have certain reliability levels and things like that.
Yeah.
All that kind of stuff.
And then when it becomes political, so that's what also leaves a bad taste in my mouth. If you see a senior politician grandstanding about it, like Cameron used to do it, he'd be like, "Oh, I was on holiday and I couldn't check out football scores, and that's terrible," and made a big thing of it. And of course, and we'll talk about this as well. We've got Boris Johnson's just come out and said we've got to have fibre everywhere by 2025. And it's like, well, where'd you get that from, Bojo? No one ever knew you were into fibre until suddenly you got this bright idea.
He's tried to hook up to his computer one day, and he's had that sort of, I think he even referred to it in the pizza wheel of death, he calls it.
Right, yes.
And that's upset him, so that's why he's decided
he's not happy.
He's not happy. That's therefore
and of course,
fibre
we'll
everywhere.
come back to it. 5G has been politicised big time. Almost every country wants to be the world leader in 5G. All the senior politicians are saying we must be fantastic, or they're saying it's terrible. Exactly.
And if we're not, then we might as well just not bother. We're just basically in the Stone Age. There's a lot of hyperbole attached to it. Well, why don't we, while we're talking about the sort of the politics and the coverage side of things, why don't we get onto that Bojo sort of fixed line things? We were chatting about this a little bit beforehand. So Boris Johnson came out and said, by 2025, I want 100% fibre or something like that. And as we know, there's tons about, full FTTP is incredibly expensive.
Yeah.
We recently spoke about it on the pod. You were in Broadband World Forum and NBN, talking about state intervention has been trying to do it. But it's not, if it's hard to get mobile coverage to 100% of the country, then it must be that much harder and more expensive to get fixed line. So I guess I'll start off. Sorry, I'll ask William again. He's a special guest. So you'll get your turn. Stop moaning.
I'm not moaning. I'm quite happy just to sit here.
I know. I was only joking. The 2025 pledge, how plausible, how useful do you think that is?
I mean, I think almost everyone in the industry would think it's pretty nuts, frankly.
Right.
It's just logistically not possible. There just
not
aren't
at any kind of reasonable expense.
No. I mean, you'd have to turn 10% of the population into road diggers or something crazy.
Right. Oh, you think just logistically getting the work done, regardless of the cost, is
exactly.
viable.
Exactly.
That's one of the problems BT has with its OpenReach has with its build out at the moment. They can't get the engineers, it can't get the staff. Just can't get the staff.
I think that's what I should be telling Jack to do for A-levels. We just had A-level evening for my son. Perhaps I should be telling him to work out
how to bury fibre,
how to lay cable.
It's that's the problem. Basically, it's just logistically enormously difficult to do, even if you had all the money to do it. And government isn't saying it's going to throw all the money that's needed at it anyway. But if you had that, you just couldn't do it. You just couldn't find enough people to do it and get those roads dug up.
My mom has been out of internet for a week now, and they switched her building to fibre, and they clearly botched it. And
she's in the UK, is she?
No, northern France.
Right.
And then with SFR, and out of internet for a week.
So
she's furious.
So they're no better at it in France than we are.
Nope.
Right.
They were like, they needed a OTN box or something to convert. And
right. Don't you love it when they start giving you techie stuff?
Yeah.
I don't care what I need. Just make the internet come back.
Exactly.
Yeah. But I think it's an interesting point. Where does he get this from? It's not clear to me that there's anyone particularly advising him who's enough of an expert in this space, or that he went out to consult the industry more widely first before doing this. It was just a kind of,
it does feel like it pulled out
5 years earlier than everyone else will be great, let's just do that.
But in his defence, I would say that it's good to have ambitious targets, and the UK has been a real laggard on fibre. So if you look at Portugal and Spain, I think are the countries that always get cited. They've got massive fibre availability now,
and if they can manage it, and they're not exactly
and the gap's
loaded.
Not huge. I think they're both on more than 70%, and the UK's on now something like 8%, I think, in terms of fibre to the premises.
Yeah.
So maybe he's thinking, look, let's aim higher. We're not going to, he's not an idiot.
Yeah.
So he's probably saying let's aim high, and maybe if we get to 60 or 70 by 2025, I don't think he seriously expects homes in the Shetlands or something to have
fibre.
Well, actually they might, because they tend to sometimes do those little community projects, don't they? But he probably doesn't seriously expect it to be everywhere. But
are you saying that to make 5G happen, we should aim for 6G then? Just like
the even numbers always do better.
They always do better. So I mean, that's the clear thing to do is go straight to 6G, miss out on 5G altogether.
It'll be poor 6G, but decent 5G.
Well, maybe if we have time, we'll put you on the spot there, William.
What's
6G all about? But yes, and I mean, it's also we were chatting about this before. There's also what is the actual practical desirability of getting fibre-like bandwidth everywhere? So, are we, Ian, did you say that they switched the target from a technology to a speed? Is that right?
Well, I think you mentioned that.
Oh, was it? Yeah.
They've gone from saying fibre everywhere to gigabit
everywhere. Yeah, which would allow
which I think makes sense, because the reason you want fibre is to get high-speed services, because you need them for the application. So I think it's silly to say, let's have a technology when we were talking about this earlier. Fibre isn't perfect. If you're using passive optical networks and it's split amongst a lot of houses and they're all streaming, Amazon Prime or something, then you could get quite slow services compared with a 5G connection serving just a couple of households, for instance.
Yeah.
So,
it's like when smartphone advertise like, oh, this got this many gigs of RAM, this new processor. I'm like, I don't care as long as it runs smoothly.
Yeah. There is that. I mean, there's a problem that technologies always have of how else to market themselves. I mean, I remember years ago, I think it was when Dyson started becoming popular as a Hoover. And prior to that, you go into John Lewis or whatever and go, I need a new Hoover. I want one that actually sucks some goddamn dirt up.
Yeah.
And so you go, well, that one's 1,000 watts, that one's 1,500 watts. 1,500 watts one must be better.
Yeah.
Must be half as good again.
Yeah.
But it's not as linear as that. It's just that people can understand the metrics.
The only thing I'd say
feed, you call them in
about the
computer.
fibre thing is, and I think you touched on this before we came in, that it's eventually, I think it probably will have to be, I mean, maybe not everywhere, but that's where it's going to go, because that's the only one that's kind of future-proof. And at the Broadband World Forum, they were talking about XGS PON, which is like the one that's in development at the moment, which will be even faster. But once you've got the infrastructure there, you can upgrade to that with new electronics and stuff. You don't actually have to. It's that business of actually digging up the streets and putting down the new, the new lines. That's the really hard part.
Yeah, because then the technology is determined at either end of the line.
Yeah, and that's the bit that you need for sort of, I hate the word, but that's sort of future proof, because if you envisage these future applications like virtual reality, and then mobile technologies and other things probably aren't going to be good.
We don't have any. There's nothing that I'm aware of, but that certainly doesn't mean it doesn't exist, that will at some time in the future render fibre obsolete. So.
Well, no,
there's nothing beyond optical.
I guess that's why they call it future-proof, because that's the thing that you can do anything.
So we've done metal, now we're doing optical. There's not some future quantum networking type of
some
thing.
Material.
Not that we're aware of. Yeah, some new nano particles scurrying around under the ground. Okay, so no one doubts that for the long term doing that, it's just what is plausible logistically and certainly what is plausible economically.
Yeah.
And then politically, if people like Boris Johnson are going to bang on about it and make it a thing, then I guess they have to be seen to be supporting it with more than just lofty aspirations.
Yeah, and at the moment we don't really see that. There's vague words about government will put some money into this somehow, somewhere, but nothing.
Because it's got so much spare cash, hasn't it?
Yeah. No real detail on that. And from what I've seen, people are saying, well, actually, these numbers are just recycling funds that are already available anyway, mostly. I don't know how true that really is, but at the moment it doesn't really seem to have any substance behind it that says this is how we're going to change the dynamics of the industry.
Do you know what? It's just occurred to me, I think he got his script wrong. When he talked about 2025, he actually meant that's when we'll leave Europe. Bit of a topical comedy there.
You want us to get onto that one, I can tell.
Just 5 more years.
Yeah, do you know what I mean? Or we'll still be asking for another extension of 3 months. In 4 years' time.
Oh, that's just what they're going to do now. Just keep asking for an extension every few
I know.
weeks.
I've seen some good satire where they go, the year is sort of 2120, and no one knows how this tradition started. And there's some guy in a ceremonial cape asking for another 3-month extension.
Yeah, I saw that too. I thought that was just so funny.
Anyway, I digress. Okay, so that's the sort of UK infrastructure side of it. I mean, what I want to move on to, actually, here's one thing which will provide a bit of a segue for that. So, if we're moving from technology type to speed, one point I wanted to make. If we now say a gigabit, as Ian was just saying, it depends how many people are using the line.
Yeah.
So all lines, whether they're over the air or in the ground, you can literally view them as pipes, and the more times that pipe has to fork, the less capacity of data is going through it. I'm sure there's lots of much more techie stuff. You're probably wincing inwardly and going, I'll just let's humour Scott on this one. But that's largely it. The more people who are using it, the less each individual is going to have.
Yeah.
So when you say when they go, we want gigabit speed, what do they mean by that? It's incredibly, when you talk about speeds with data, it can be very elusive. Is it gigabit to the cabinet? Is it gigabit when at 4 a.m. when everyone else is asleep?
Well, that's why I find all these speed tests that certain people have been doing on 5G networks to be a bit daft, really, because they're probably the only person in the whole UK doing a speed. Certainly in the cell that they're doing it in, and you see these blogs turning up. I got 600 megabits per second on. Ease. Now it's like, well, of course you did, because nobody else has got a 5G phone
Paolo
for 100 miles.
Yeah, Paolo loves tweeting a speed test, doesn't he?
Well, I wasn't going to mention any names.
Well, he does tweet them. It's in the public domain.
They are. Yeah.
So I guess it's up to gigabit speed then.
Well, but then we've had like all kinds of advertising standard stuff about that, but you're not allowed to say up to anymore.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because it's bullshit. You can say up
minimum.
to, but it only happened on one time of the year in a full moon beginning with Z or something.
I guess they can't provide a minimum guarantee. That's the problem.
I mean, they could, but the cost would be so astronomical, and it would be really pointless to do. It would be like giving everyone their own private motorway.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, in principle, you could do something like that, but it would be ridiculous to do it.
But that's why I think I'm not particularly happy about them switching it from technology to speed. However, on the flip side, as we're talking about, there are still technologies that can improve the bandwidth of copper, like GFast and all that sort of thing. And of course, we've got fixed wireless access over 5G, which I certainly know. I've seen speed tests for 5G that get up to a gig and plus.
Yeah.
So then I can see why you don't want to fixate on one technology. What do you think about them focusing more on speed than the technology in their sort of targets?
Well, I think you certainly shouldn't focus on technology because, as we just said, nobody wants a technology. They want a service.
An outcome.
Yeah. And governments always claim to be technology neutral. They don't want to pick winners or the other kind of thing. And then they've done it in spades by saying fibre. So from every sensible point of view, you shouldn't fixate on the technology. You should leave it to the industry, the market, or whatever, to deliver the right technology. You should say what outcome you want. So that does mean, speeds are more sensible. But actually, we then get into what do you say? Do you talk about the peak speed? Do you talk about the average speed? Do you talk about the worst possible speed that you might get in the situation where everyone in the street's all streaming at the same time? Or do you in fact talk about services that actually you'll always be able to watch 4 TV channels in your home, whatever happens, kind of thing, or not? And it's just such a difficult thing to pick on. I was at Ofcom for quite a few years, and we went around this, and each time we thought we'd kind of cracked it, the world had moved on to a different speed and a different set of applications, and we realised that we had to tweak it again, and then you realise it just can't really do it. So
I've forgotten about that Ofcom stuff.
Yeah.
When was that you were there?
I was there from 2003 when it was formed.
So were you there when Stephen Carter was
I was. Yeah.
Our illustrious leader.
Yeah.
Hello, Stephen.
Yep. And through till 2010, so 7 years.
Oh, right. And but were you like a consultant, or were you part of the furniture?
No, I was. I had a number of different titles, but essentially I headed up the technology team there.
Oh, cool.
So, but I also wrote.
I feel even more humbled by your greater experience.
So interesting, right? So I mean, long and short of it, I'm not sure there's an easy answer other than, let people talk about their experiences, and if they're not getting a good experience, then let's look into it in more detail. But I think it's just saying it's a gigabit.
Yeah, isn't there some way you could standardise a little bit more, like say certain speed to the cabinet, for example, or certain speed to a certain node, and then you could perhaps even have some degree of public information about how many clients that node is supplying.
So you could say it's got to be at least 10 gigabits to the cabinet and what's called a contention ratio split of no more than 20 or something like that.
Right,
so
I'll settle for that.
You could specify all that
Sorted.
kind of stuff. Yep.
See, I should be at Ofcom.
Yeah, which is all well and good until England are playing football on one particular night, and every single person wants to watch it in super high definition at home that particular evening, and then that one time it gets a bit screwed because it wasn't dimensioned for that.
Fair enough. No, I mean, obviously I was being sort of flippant to a certain degree, but it does strike me that they could do better to de-techify it and standardise some of this stuff for even for people like me, whose job it is to try and pass it on to everyone else. But anyway,
and I think back to your point about the Hoover, it is a big issue in the industry at the moment. 5G must be better than 4G because 5 is bigger than 4. Yeah. Gigabit must be better than 100 megabits because that's got to be a bigger number, surely. And people haven't yet managed to understand, because it's a moving target, it's a complex target, what they really need and what actually makes sense. Whereas if we look at other things like cars now, people don't fixate on brake horsepower anymore. They understand that beyond a certain point, unless you're really into racing your car around a circuit, you don't need any more than a certain amount, and there's other things that matter.
And nearly all cars are going to get a job done.
Yeah, wasn't Paul saying when we had him on that it's all about the interior now?
Exactly.
Actually.
Yeah.
And features that you provide, that didn't used to come in cars, like having Spotify through the speakers and that sort of thing.
Yeah, just a decent engine that doesn't break down and gets you off the lights in half decent fashion. Is just table stakes. People assume it.
But operators are still competing on speed, because they don't really have a clue about what else to compete on. So.
No, well, that's a good segue, isn't it? Into what I threatened for us to talk about, which is more sort of making money out of 5G.
Yeah.
So, one of the reasons, as we mentioned earlier, one of the reasons people will collaborate is because it's hard to make money out of it. And, we'll get on to a specific example at the end of this podcast of where it could be difficult to make money out of 5G. But, just sort of top line, William, what are your thoughts on how So I can't remember the last time. Was it a year ago we had you in here?
Probably about that, yeah.
Yeah. It wouldn't have been in here, would it? It would have been in the last place. How, in that intervening year, now that 5G's real and kicked off, how's the industry doing as far as actually monetizing it goes?
Not very well is my assessment, with a few exceptions. So from what I see from South Korea, it looks like they are managing to do a bit better there. Whether that's a cultural thing from South Korea, unclear. But for the most part, a few operators have tried to launch 5G with a premium, but then often their competitors come in and say, no, you can have it for the same price. It's happened in the UK. And we saw exactly that in 4G. EE launched with a premium. Competitors came in with the same rate.
But EE had a fairly big head start, didn't it? Yeah. So they probably had about a year of coining it on that premium because they'd been given that 1800 spectrum, hadn't they? They've been allowed to refarm it, if I remember that right. Yeah.
So you get a very small amount, but it's not a big number of subscribers that you transfer over during that
early
time.
Adopter.
So
Adopter/gullible types.
So it looks, as almost everyone said, that actually from the consumer you probably won't see much of a revenue increase. So then everyone has said, well, that's okay, we accept that. So what other sources of revenue can we find? And there's a long stream of the enterprise and the Internet of Things and autonomous cars. There's other kind of stuff that people have talked about. But none of that has moved on at all, I would have said. And people, I think, are increasingly realizing that it's really, really hard to turn that stuff into money for the operators.
It is. Actually, sorry, were you going to say something?
I was at a 5G summit organized by let's say a Chinese vendor this week, and
that doesn't begin with H.
Yeah, and I was listening to presentations, and I was thinking we're going to have to move away from data caps, right? There's just no way, because I just actually moved from 4 gigs a month to 12 gigs a month for just £1 more, and I'm thinking if I had 5G and I was using that actual speed, those 12 gigs would be gone in 2 days.
Yeah.
So we have to move like the Vodafone tiered thing, right?
Yeah.
I'm asking because I just don't see any other way.
Yeah. Well, even on the 4G side now, they've my cat got upgraded to a new device, and I was on 8 gig a month before, and they've all you need tariff is 60 gig a month, which is more than I need.
Yeah.
But I was thinking,
Oh wow.
But I guess my son will sit and watch. I mean, a bit like yours, I suppose. On his way back from school, he'll watch YouTube videos, and his data allowance has gone in no time. And then if you're watching it in HD, perhaps on a phone in future, then you can see how people will use what they're given, and if it's unlimited, then you don't have to worry about it.
I've got quite a fun thing with EE. So I'm on EE and I've got everyone else, my wife, my kids on it, but I'm just SIM only. And last time I was just chatting about whether or not I was getting a good deal. I might have said this on the pod before, so I'll keep it quick. But the person said, "Look, why don't you give yourself a ton of data?" And by a ton, I don't mean that much, but like 20 gig a month, something like that. And EE, to be fair to them, they do through the app make it relatively easy to gift data.
Yeah,
it's a bit clunky, but it's not too tedious a process. So now at the start of each month, I'm just like I'm the data master.
you're the
bank. You're
the banker,
maybe
the
Lord.
50.
Yeah, and I just dish out. And like with Jack, so like Mary Clark, who we've had on the pod a couple of times, she always says, I think she has on the pod, that she works in the industry obviously, and she treats her sons as a sort of barometer of data consumption, because one of them at least is exactly as you described, just caning the YouTube.
But I think this is the real killer application of 5G, and be interested to get your perspective on this. It's basically keeping pace with what people want to do on the application side, and if they were to use 4G technology, then they'd have to put in so many new masts and acquire spectrum from somewhere and to be able to do it, whereas at least with 5G, they can provide those unlimited services and keep the cost base kind of looking the same. They're not going to make any more money out of it, but they can sort of protect the margins they have.
So it's just a capacity thing then?
It's just an extra capacity thing.
Yeah, certainly 5G is absolutely fine for that. Big chunk of extra spectrum, and it really is a big chunk actually when you look at it in terms of... But
it's only fine once you start to get into outside of like the kind of licensed spectrum we do now, into mid-band and then millimetre wave and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so the mid-band 3.5 gigahertz is the main chunk that they're looking at. It is higher up the frequency band than the other stuff, so it won't go quite so far. That may be balanced by these so-called massive MIMO beamforming antennas, gives them a bit more range. it's going to be tricky. But if they just use it in the areas where the cells are already quite small in city centres, then the shorter range isn't so much of a penalty.
But I think we're going to get a fairly slow rollout of 5G coverage, especially in that area. I mean, obviously there's certain technologies where you can just refarm existing like 4G spectrum. You know, the sort of 800 up to 2.5 or whatever. And that's fine. But as we just sort of discussed, to get the really fat pipes, you've got to go up to 3.5, which presumably requires a lot more sort of actual infrastructure investment. I mean, do you need whole new sort of antennas, whole new transmitters?
You need new antennas, and that's one of the big question marks around this band. Is you need these beamforming active antennas, and they're wonderful bits of kit, but they're big things. You know, they're kind of like 0.5 meter by a meter, and
they're expensive as well.
They're expensive. They can weigh over 50 kilos, which means an awful lot of existing mast structures just aren't strong enough to handle the multiple ones of these.
Pretty hard. We're going to have accidents now.
So it's tough, and they're doing all this to stay at the same revenue point. I mean, it's very kind of them. It's very nice of them to keep upping our data packages for an extra cost.
The size and weight of these things is something that's not actually been addressed a lot. And the only person on the operator side that I've heard talk about it was someone from Orange in Spain, where Jamie and I were actually at a 5G Core Summit. So it's not this area, but he said they haven't launched. I think they might have done now, but he was talking about pushing the launch to 2020. And one of the reasons was he said that the equipment's not good enough at the moment. It's too heavy. It's too big. There's just, and I mean, that wasn't the only issue. There was spectrum had been awarded in bits, and they needed it to be kind of rejigged so that it's contiguous. But this equipment issue was a big one, and you don't hear in other markets. You don't hear operators going on about that a lot. They just seem to have sort of rushed into doing what they're doing, I guess. And I know they haven't built much of it at the moment, but it sounds like they need things to get a lot better before they can really go for a mass market deployment.
Yeah, and it's not clear how much better they can get, how quickly. They're that big because they've got to have lots of antenna elements, lots of bits of RF amplifier-y kind of stuff in there as well. And over time that will improve, but they're always going to be big. They have to be physically that size, just so that you get the distance between the antennas that allows you to form a beam. It's like why you need a big telescope to see a long way. You need a big antenna to form a beam that's quite tight. That's just a physical property. So size is always going to be an issue for them. And these are the kind of things. It's interesting. We started by talking about the rural network deployment. All the announcements say they're going to deploy a 4G network.
Right.
So if 5G were so wonderful and so much cheaper and everything else, why would they put in 4G? And the answer is it's not actually cheaper in a greenfield site. 4G is actually pretty cost effective. It's only where you need a lot of capacity, which you don't in rural areas, where you put 5G on top of 4G, and that's the most cost effective way of
again, I'm going to say this for you to correct me, but if one of the main reasons 5G gives us more bandwidth is because you're just using more spectrum at higher frequencies that are not used by other ones. And we know that the propagation characteristics of the higher frequency spectrums are sort of exponentially, or at least it trails off quite rapidly, doesn't it? Then you're not going to use mid-band for rural coverage where you want one mast to cover several miles.
Absolutely not.
So that seems like an obvious answer to your 4G question, but I get your hypothetical question of if it's so great, why aren't we using it? But there's another example. So I think there's lots of limitations. I know you're not at all hesitant about being down on 5G. I think the last podcast we did, you had a pop at a lot of the promises being made on its behalf. But I think that's a great example. I think it's really handy for people in the middle of London. If there aren't too many other people using it who want to be able to stream in HD and all that sort of thing. But there's all kinds of use cases that it doesn't really address. And actually, just to flip it, I know it's not an intrinsic part of 5G, but it becomes, when people discuss it, it becomes synonymous for reasons which perhaps you could help explain. But IoT, which I know a big area for you because you're involved in sort of low power WAN sort of stuff, technologies. Firstly, the first question to you is why do you think people go on about IoT in the context of 5G so much? I mean, I've got some ideas I'd like to hear from you. And secondly, that the profitability, we spoke about a little bit about this off camera, but if you could comment on the possibility of operators actually making any decent money off IoT, that would be good. But let's start with why 5G and IoT sort of
Yeah, so I don't know quite how it all came about, but fairly early on in 5G, there was this triangle that a lot of people remember with the three different use cases, the enhanced mobile broadband, which is kind of what we've talked about up till now, then what they called massive machine communications, which was meant to be sort of IoT on steroids, and then the low latency stuff. So kind of within this vision, I think it was just like all these visions. You kind of bundle up everything you can think of, chuck it in there, so we'll do it all. And IoT was bubbling, so I guess they thought, well, we can't have bog standard IoT because that's happening. We'll have super duper IoT and we'll call it massive IoT.
And I guess they knew 5G had to be about more than just enhanced mobile broadband, because then it'll just be more 4G.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of the genesis. But then the propaganda and the hype steeped in, and everyone started saying, well, 5G is going to be the way that we're going to connect all these machines. But actually, of course, we can do it okay now with NB-IoT, the standard that's running on 4G, or indeed LoRa or these other self-deployed kind of systems. So 5G is not a kind of a switch to flip to say that before 5G we couldn't do IoT and after 5G we can. It's in fact quite the opposite. We can do IoT if we want to now, and Vodafone and others are deploying narrowband IoT. And actually, at the moment, there is no enhanced IoT element within the 5G standards.
No.
The assumption is that NB-IoT, the 4G standard, will evolve into something that will turn into 5G.
Be somehow an order of magnitude better.
Yeah. So actually, that whole thing is rather distorted. And the bigger question is IoT working for the mobile operators at the moment? Because if it isn't, then 5G isn't going to change that, because there's nothing materially different in 5G.
And is it?
It doesn't appear to be, in so much as none of the operators that I know of are out there publicly talking about how wonderfully quickly their subscription levels are growing. And whenever people aren't publicly divulging what's happening with their technology or their service, I'm always suspicious that the reason they're not saying anything about it is because it's not doing all that well. Yeah. So absent much information, my observation, I think, is actually they're not signing up an awful lot of these devices. And each device that they do sign up, whatever that might be, a smart street lamp or dustbin or cat collar or whatever it is going to be a tiny amount of revenue compared to what you and I pay for our mobile phones. So, and
it's not that recurring either, is it? It tends to be just a one-off for the module.
It could be a one-off
and a single sort of subscription fee.
Yeah. So you can buy I was telling you earlier, Scott, you can buy an NB-IoT SIM card, which is valid for 10 years and has 100 megabytes of data for €10. Well, that's enough data for 10 years for your average smart dustbin or whatever it might be.
It's €1 a year.
So it's €1 a year, which is insignificant compared to what we pay.
You've got a massive scale for that to be worth your time.
Yeah, and even Ericsson in their wildest dreams only forecast 50 billion IoT devices worldwide. And if you segment that down and you look at the numbers that Cisco are publishing, 80-90% of those are indoors. They're smart speakers and things like that. So they connect over Wi-Fi or Bluetooth.
Okay.
So only about 10% of that is probably outdoor cellular addressable. So that's 5 billion. And that's a bit less than the number of people with smartphones. So we might have one of these devices per smartphone.
But you're only getting a quid a year out of it.
You're only getting a quid a year. So it's not a big market.
No.
And in a way that's a shame, because it's a useful market. For this, it's all
and
this stuff.
It will happen.
Yeah.
You get this. I think the stuff that's always illustrated it best for me as some of the smart factory sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Just ways in which if everything's got a connected chip in it, you can automate so much more. You can rationalise, and the logistics are much more efficient and lean.
Absolutely,
and all that sort of thing. But yes, again, for the operators to make any cash out,
No, I was just going to say that the point about 5G, I think, in terms of making NB-IoT or LTE-M, which is the other kind of cellular one, more efficient, which is probably what they'll do, is that all that's going to do is exacerbate the pricing problem. Because I think one reason that there aren't that many subscriptions at the moment is that it's still perceived to be, even though costs are really low compared to what you make from a smartphone, it's still too expensive for some of the things that organisations would like to do with it.
Absolutely.
The module costs are too high, and the
so the business case still isn't great for them.
So you might get a really efficient version of it that comes along with 5G, and with the core network systems they can support a lot more traffic, but they're not going to make anything at all. No. So it's like a, you might have tens of millions of things in an area, but they're making basically nothing from each device.
Yeah.
So, and Vodafone, I think I did look at their numbers. They're on about 85 million devices at the moment, IoT devices, which sounds like globally, and it sounds like a lot. But if you think in the forecast of tens of billions. Well, it's and they're a global operator. They're one of the big sort of 10 or whatever, I guess. It's not very much, and the revenues they get from that and that's not just connectivity. That's the whole IoT revenues is about 2% of group revenues at the moment.
And they're actually often a monopoly provider, aren't they? So I think in the UK at least, they're the only operator that's rolled out NB-IoT that I know of. I think that's true in quite a few other markets.
And they're quite comparable, I think, to the other, like DT, I think, publishes figures as well, and they're on sort of 1 or 2% in terms of contribution to overall revenue. So it's nothing. It's not a game changer business for them.
Oh, and one other thing I've heard regarding the IoT in a 5G context question is network slicing, in so much as the point. Again, from my top-line perspective of network slicing, is that you can fundamentally change the sort of nature and the dynamic of the network depending on what your customers need it for at a given time. So if the network's almost entirely being used by consumers, then the slice that's enhanced mobile broadband is by far the biggest.
Yeah.
But if you're using it to power a smart factory, then you give it over much more to things like low latency, ultra reliable, and/or IoT and that sort of thing. Is that sort of network slicing utopia? Does that make any difference to the sort of viability of it all?
I don't think so. So I ran some interesting numbers using some of this crowdsourcing stuff. We talked about it earlier on, actually. I used a company called Tutela, but they're the same as many others. And I looked at how many of the measurements they make are what I call an acceptable quality. So you get at least a megabit in both directions, your latency is below 50 milliseconds, and you've got a good signal. So you could easily do video calling, you could do pretty good web browsing over that. So the sort of things that you might imagine a company might want to do with remote Salesforce or whatever. So the question is, how often do you get that? And I looked at only at the areas where the signal levels is okay. Because if the signal level's poor, you can slice the network any way you like, but it's always going to be poor.
Yeah.
You're never going to get a good signal. And the answer was about 99% of the time at the moment, which is pretty damn good, actually, if you think about it. You've got a 99% chance of getting the sort of connection that will give you that kind of thing, as long as the signal level's good. Now, when we experience worse, often it's because the signal level's just not good enough, but slicing doesn't help you at all with that.
No.
So you're going to a manufacturer or whoever, and you're saying, well, you've got 99% at the moment, but if you pay 5 times as much, we'll give you 99.3%.
Right.
But it's still not going to work in the 10% of the places where the signal level's crap.
Right.
Is that a sensible offering? It's hard to see.
Yeah.
That there's a lot of people that will go for that.
But I mean, when people talk about ultra reliable, I assume there'd be an order of magnitude greater reliability when you're selling something as ultra reliable.
No. So I mean, fundamentally, when there's no signal, it's not going to be reliable. So it really predominantly comes down to, do you have signal wherever you want it?
Right.
And some people will, because they happen to be in a place with perfect coverage or whatever. But then it's great all the time. Another factor is, does the network ever go down? And actually, they're pretty good. O2 went down, and everyone will have it breaks loose. But actually, if you look at it, how often are they down? It's not that bad. Too bad.
And then normally sort it out.
And then the last one is, are you going to your point, are you going to be bumped off the network because it's overly congested? To which the data I've pulled suggests, actually, not that often.
Okay.
Now, I'm sure we could find some situations, sports stadium, at the time of a football game or something, where the answer is, every time that happens, you'll be bumped off. So there may be some situations. But actually, the ultra-reliable bit isn't really inherent in 5G particularly.
No.
That's just a radio engineering problem. And unless you throw a lot more coverage at the situation, you don't improve that. And back to our earlier point, the operators aren't really paying for coverage unless government chips in and helps them out on that.
That is back to our earlier point. Okay, we're running out of time, so I'm gonna move it on. I just remembered, actually, Pierre, I never did the bit at the beginning where I say what we're going to talk about. So now you don't get to.
We can do a summary at the end about what we did talk about.
We could do that.
We can do some clever editing and.
Yeah,
exactly.
I'll just put it in regardless.
Okay, so the other bit of news that was big this week that both you and I covered yesterday, Ian, was Nokia's numbers. And I'll just briefly tee it up, but then I'll hand it over to you, partly because I haven't let you do much talking.
It's okay.
Basically, their numbers, they were all right for this quarter, but their outlook for the next quarter and then the next year or two after that was quite gloomy.
Yeah.
And so that in itself was obviously a nasty shock for investors. And then they also said we're going to suspend the dividend.
Yeah.
Exactly, Pierre's sitting there thinking, as an amateur investor myself, I don't like the sound of that.
No.
His 5% holding of Nokia is...
But I mean, that's why I've always found dividends a little bit strange. I'm thinking, why doesn't the company just reinvest it or something? But, that's just how shareholder capitalism works. People...
Thanks for investing.
Yeah.
Here's some money.
Exactly. And when you give a dividend, it makes share price go up. And when you take it away, it makes share price go down. And so that would have been one of the bigger factors behind Nokia's share price going down 20-25% yesterday.
Yeah.
So, Ian, why don't you tell us a little bit more about, how they explain themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think the dividends probably, like you say, it's a lot to do with why the share price went down so much. But I think there's probably serious concerns about as you said, the figures themselves don't make you look at it and go, you wouldn't sort of come away if you didn't know much about the market and expect a company like that to fall a quarter in terms of its value. Because I think their revenues were up about... on a reported basis, they were up, I think, about 3 or 4% on a reported basis.
On a currency basis, it was just 1%.
And so
but still, it's up.
Yeah, but I think
down,
that's the issue. Is if you compare it with, so they were up 1% in constant currency, and I think that's on the network side as well. I think it's about that.
Yeah.
And then you look at what Ericsson's doing, and they're up about 4 or 5% on the network side, and they're guiding for quite a big increase, I think, next year, Ericsson at the moment. And Nokia's saying we're now, having previously said we're going to outperform the market, they're now saying we're going to be in line with the market, not only this year, but next year as well. So I think everybody's now suddenly thinking there's a sort of competitiveness issue in a market where there's only 3 big players.
Yeah.
And Huawei doesn't really seem to have been as badly disrupted on the network side by all this US pressure as I think everybody was expecting.
I think we can assume they're doing at least as well as ever in those markets they're allowed to operate in.
Which is pretty much all of them.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they were never allowed in the US anyway since 2012, I think.
We've got a few others. Australia. I don't think too much sign of them in Korea. Do you?
They're in Korea.
LGU Plus.
They have a deal with LGU Plus, but they never have business with the other 2 operators anyway. So they've not really had. There's not that many instances where they've sort of been kicked out of a project because someone said you're a security threat. So.
We're still, as ever, prevaricating and making up our mind.
Exactly. And other countries
we'll
are
ask
as well,
Europe for 3 more months to make up our mind.
We're not the only ones doing that. But I think people are just looking at Nokia and saying, are they, is there sort of competitiveness issue there?
Yeah.
And then it transpires that they've... They won't actually say we underinvested in 5G and sort of got it wrong themselves.
No, that'd be a hell of a thing to just come out.
But their CFO did say when I was talking to him that it came along quite quickly, took us and others by surprise, and we also had the Alcatel-Lucent merger to kind of deal with.
So you mean like 5G?
Time. So there's a pretty strong hint there.
5G hitting the streets about a year earlier than.
Well, I think the Alcatel-Lucent thing's really interesting actually for them, because if you think that took place in 2016, and I don't know how long they were thinking about it in advance, but this is obviously 5G's well in development in that sort of time frame, and then they decided to accelerate it, which probably didn't suit perhaps Nokia. I don't know, but you're accelerating it at a time when it has all this integration process to deal with. It's bringing 2 overlapping portfolios together, and you can certainly see why that would have caused problems for them compared with a company like. Ericsson and Nokia, which are just dealing with the same business, they're not going through any kind of big acquisition. And then, so they're now saying, even though they're not sort of saying we did underinvest, but they're now saying we need to invest more in 5G to basically get things back on track. And it's not going to turn things around until 2021.
No, and they've got more immediate problems. So looking at their numbers, their cash pile, this time last year they had about $1.5 billion. Now it's down to about 1/3 of $1 billion.
Well, they won't start paying the dividend out again until it gets to $2 billion.
Yeah. And I think they're gonna recoup a big chunk of that in Q4 because margins are much better than Q4. I mean, the margin this quarter was about 8.5%, and expected to be about double that in Q4.
Yeah,
so obviously
expecting to be at 1.5 billion cash at the end of the year.
Yeah, so they reckon they're gonna trouser in excess of €1 billion in Q4 by not paying out a dividend. And the dividends then, incidentally, certainly in Q3, I think was about 320 million.
Yeah.
So Q4 point is Q4 was obviously always a good quarter. It was always an exceptional quarter in terms of cash flow for them. Yeah. But they've decided they need to keep that extra 300 million or so that they would otherwise have given to shareholders. And just back of fag packet maths, if they didn't do that and they just kept declining in terms of cash balance on how they have been, they would actually run out of money.
Yeah.
Notwithstanding this Q4 boost.
Yeah.
So, so there was a more immediate thing. They spun it as, and I believe them, but they spun it as we need this extra cash for R&D. And I think we feel they also need it so that they can compete on price in certain places. Like China apparently is savagely competitive on price for 5G.
Well, I think that's the other problem they've got is that Ericsson's suddenly in this mood where it's decided that it wants to build its market share. They lost a lot of market share in the 4G era when Huawei came along, and their latest strategy is basically they think they're pretty competitive on the 5G side now. And they want to go into markets, and you see evidence of them doing this and being really price competitive, but also, the classic case recently was the deal they did in Norway with Telia, where they've gone in to a network where Huawei had some presence there, and they've basically said, we're gonna build you a nationwide 5G network by the end of 2023, and we're going to do it on fairly good terms. And Telia said yes, please, and basically they're phasing out Huawei.
Yeah.
And there's a few instances where they've either sort of replaced Huawei or Nokia on the network side, and so there's this pricing pressure and this sort of resurgent Ericsson that Nokia's got to contend with.
And that's actually quite a strategic pivot by Boyer, because for the first couple of years of him being in there, he said we're about restoring profitability.
Yeah. Well, they're still saying they can do that. Still, even though they're saying there's some margin pressure, they're still quite confident of hitting those targets that he came out with. Even though
he reckons he can.
Yeah,
he reckons they can drop their trousers a little bit on price.
He reckons they can drop
to win business.
Yeah, your expression. He thinks they can do that and still hit this target. I think of 12% in the next 2 years.
I don't know what Swedish for that is. But he said it there. So we banged on about it. Do you have any thoughts on sort of Nokia's apparent predicament?
To me, I sort of take a step back. I think what's this telling us about the overall telecoms industry? We talked a bit about the mobile operators not making a lot of revenue, or at least not making enough profit that they can go off and cover rural areas and such like. In a way, this should be the real buoyant time for the manufacturers. 5G is coming along typically at the start of a new generation. There's a lot of operators out there wanting a lot more kit, and so suddenly you get this big spike in sales. So we should be in a situation where we're seeing suddenly massive growth, 10, 20, 30% revenue growth as everyone piles in and buys this kit. And we're not, because actually most operators are not spending any more money than they were in the past. They're just switching their capex from upgrading their 3G to 4G to upgrading their 4G to 5G. Yeah. So it's kind of. And
Dell'Oro, which is one of the sort of experts on the market sizing, only has it growing about 2% a year, don't they?
Yeah.
So that's not exactly boom time, is it? 2% growth.
No. So overall, we're in an industry that, it pains me to say because I'm in it too, but it's heading towards a utility kind of business type situation.
Which is the recurring subject that always comes up.
Yeah. And that probably means that sooner or later we need to think about structural changes in the industry that will allow that kind of an environment
also
to make money.
Your issue about going to one network and active sharing, which we came in and started talking about, I think that's another challenge at the moment as well. So this news, the big one in China is like a really hot area at the moment because 5G tenders are about to get awarded there. So everybody's, that's a massive market. I think Econ was saying that's about 60% of the 4G market is China.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that's huge, getting deals in that particular market. Now, this active network sharing deal between Telecom and Unicom, you've got a lot of people saying that sounds like a lot less business for the vendors, basically.
Yeah.
If they're sharing base stations. And I remember speaking to Ericsson about this when they had their earnings the other week, and they were saying, well, it's better to have one strong vendor than two weak ones, and you still need the capacity. But they would say that. They're going to try and look on the bright side, and there is a valid point there. But it's basically just one network instead of two now.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. If you have active sharing, you pretty much only have half the kit between two operators, and that means you only need to spend half as much with your equipment manufacturer. So it all suggests this is not a short-term thing.
Yeah.
We're going to see these issues for quite some time until the industry works out a way to address them. And to some degree, the manufacturing industry has been doing it for the last decade. There's been mergers no end. If you go back 10 years, there was probably, 10 or more major suppliers of telecoms equipment, and they've all been collapsing down slowly over time. It's hard to imagine we could collapse down much further than we're at now, but I don't quite see what else we can do to move forward in this situation.
Yeah, I suppose the flip side, because we got to wrap it up in a second. I don't want to Don't want to necessarily conclude on that we're all screwed note.
I hope not.
But the flip side is that yes, I think there seems to be no escaping the greater sort of commodification of the actual provision of the basic service. That is more and more like a utility. And again, this is a recurring cliche, but if they are going to get some decent sort of revenue growth and all that sort of thing, and maybe even start putting on swanky press trips again. It's been a while since they did those, isn't it?
Yeah.
Then it's going to be through all this clever sort of added value stuff, integrating with industry, helping them do smart factories and all that jazz. So yes, the gloomy side is just providing straight up connectivity is a slowly declining in terms of profitability. But the opportunities are there. There's just not that much sign that operators are great at grabbing them, is there? But that's a whole other podcast. Did you have something else that you want to?
No, I was going to say that we don't want to get into a whole discussion about Open RAN now at the end of it, but that's another thing that adds to the pricing pressure, I think. I mean, that's not a good news story for the big vendors, really. It's breaking up the RAN and making it easier for other smaller companies to come in, and that really is commodity equipment and open source software. So it's not so it's good possibly for the operators if they're trying to get equipment into hard places and they're trying to sort of get more innovation there and get prices down. But it's just further pressure on the big kit vendors, really.
And maybe the future is actually a different kind of model where we've got Open RAN, we've got people building mini networks here and there that are then aggregated up by the Googles or whatever of this world into large collective networks that bring together lots of different technologies with Wi-Fi and other things and seamless roaming over the whole lot. And it all becomes a bit more like the internet is right now, where you don't have to have one provider providing internet for the whole country.
No one's thinking about Cisco routers and stuff when they're on the internet.
And that could be that could be a vibrant new era of telecoms. But it's very hard to see how you get to there from where we are at the moment.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Well, thanks a lot for coming in. It's great. I'm sorry it took us a year.
That's all right. It's great to be back.
No, I think you were here this year. Come on.
I can't remember.
Yeah, somewhere in March, I think.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go for that. I look forward to seeing you on the 7th. In fact, you saying that you're going to turn up on the 7th gives me a chance to plug it one more time. If William, who used to be the head boffin at Ofcom, can turn up to our event, then it's obviously well worth coming to. So make sure you turn up. Or
and when you're coming, because you said there's bacon sandwiches.
Yes, and booze.
And booze.
Actually, that's a good point. So I personally oversaw this. I said, look, we got to put on a proper spread of coffee when people arrive, bacon sandwiches and pastries, and then we've got to have beer and wine at lunchtime. So it should be a giggle as well. Cool. All right, thanks a lot for coming. Great to see you. And thanks a lot for listening. Make sure you join us for the next one.